Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Free Speech Forward podcast. We are in for an episode that I think is really going to be a treat today because today we're focusing not just on the speech and what you say, but also the other half of the equation of free speech, which is the importance of listening. And we're going to get to talk about listening with music as well, which for me personally is one of my favorite forms of expression. So I just can't wait to get into this one and introduce you to our guest, Shaka Mitchell. But I'm going to turn it over now to my co-founder and co-host, Chris. He will give you the official bio for Shaka and we can get started today.
Great. Thank you, Joya. And thanks, Shaka, for joining us today.
You bet. Thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you. And I will echo Joya's. That makes two of us in terms of music being one of my favorite expressions. So I definitely am excited about this conversation. For all of our listeners out there, Shaka Mitchell is a senior fellow at the American Federation for Children. Based in Nashville, he's a lawyer, facilitator, and national leader in education reform policy. Shaka also serves as a co-host of the Quality Matters podcast. He's also the creator of the Come Together Music Project, which uses music to find common ground between people from divergent political, ideological, and socioeconomic backgrounds. So you are our first guest, I think, to have a kind of musical bent to your work and career. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to share about that. And I'll just turn it over to you because we usually like to start by just asking our guests to share with us your kind of origin story, as we call it, of how you came to being an activist or leader for free speech causes.
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, thanks for having me on. And I look forward to our conversation. I know that both of you have musical backgrounds as well, or some music in your history. And so I look forward to exploring kind of how I believe that can help us when it comes to having these conversations involving free speech or even about free speech. So we'll get to that. In terms of my origin story, I'll try to keep it brief because that's the least interesting thing, I think. But for as long as I can remember, I've just been curious about things. And I think that, as a kid, like I just wanted to know how things worked. Ideas always mattered to me. And I think if ideas matter to you, then speech has to matter to you, right? Because you've got to ask questions. You've got to sort of push on the edges and see, hey, how does this idea work? Or how does this policy or solution work? As you mentioned, my day job at the American Federation for Children is as an advocate for school choice. Education is nothing if not speech, right? That's what's happening for our children throughout the day. They are consuming these ideas and digesting them, and that is speech. I don't believe you can have education that is absent speech, not a formal education. And so when we think about at least K-12 education, one of the things that I think about is like, who dictates how children are educated? Is it the government or is it parents? And core to all of that really are issues of free speech and conscience. And so I think that's a little bit how I came to this. I spent some time working at a constitutional law firm called the Institute for Justice, where we worked on both education issues and also some First Amendment issues. And I really just loved that time and saw the real world impact that this can have on people's lives.
I really want to pick up on something you mentioned here where you talked about the importance of speech and also of conscience in terms of speech. And I'd love to hear you speak more about that. That really is a topic. As much as we talk about free speech all the time, we haven't heard as many people make that connection. And so I'd love to hear you speak more about that, how you see that shows up in education and what you would say to everyone. I mean, unfortunately, we live in a cultural climate where free speech is not as respected and appreciated as it used to be. So why would you say that free speech is so important to flourish as a student who's growing up, who's trying to reach their potential as an individual, and then also for the society, for the school communities we're building, for the world that these children are growing up into?
Yeah, well, if you think about children in particular, right, speech is kind of one of the only tools and one of the only weapons, if you will, that they have by which they can arm themselves in a world full of grown-ups. And so in the school context, kids need to be able to ask questions. They also need to be able to sometimes push back against ideas that maybe don't conform and comport with their conscience. And I know a child's conscience and their sort of sense of self is still developing. But if you think about things, say, in the religious context, right? In like certain families, every family has values, but families with particular values may find that when they send their kids to school, that those values that they have at home are in conflict with what's happening at school.
Mm.
And if that's the case, and a child says something about it, or if a parent says something about it, well, that's not necessarily the parent being trying to be disruptive, right? That's a speech issue. That
Mm.
is both speech and conscience. Because how are you going to evidence your conscience? How are you going to communicate out your values? Well, you're going to have to write them down, or you're going to have to talk about them.
Mm.
There was just recently a case that came out of California, I believe. It's called Mahmoud v. Taylor, and the U.S. Supreme Court. It went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they actually found for the families. But this was a case where a school district decided that it was not going to give parents the option to opt out of certain lessons. They had in prior years given the option to opt out of certain lessons, and we're not talking about like math or grammar. This was things that were more about like sex education stuff and whatever. And frankly, by and large, like something like 98, 99% of the families didn't care, and they were like, okay, fine. But you had some families who said, hey, we're just not comfortable with that. We don't think that is what we want you, school, communicating to our child. We want to do that at home. And the school actually said, well, we're not even going to give you the option. We're not even going to tell you when it's happening, and we're not going to give you the option to opt
Mm.
out. And the Supreme Court said that's not okay. Parents are the ones who are have the right of the care, custody, and control of their children. So again, to me, those two things are really inextricably linked: speech and conscience and education.
Got it. And it sounds like you're kind of making the link that's why free speech matters, right? It's because you need to be able. I like how you put that, to either write or speak aloud your values, your ideas, and you can't really do that in an environment where that speech is squelched, which I think was probably the underlying principle at stake in that case you cited, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that's right.
because I guess you could say certain topics do cross over more into the kind of values and ideology category versus, kind of, uh, I don't know what category you'd call the kind of classics, math, science, grammar, etc. So that maybe is the distinction perhaps the court was making.
Yeah, a little bit. There's a lot there, as with any Supreme Court case, right? This was just a pretty specific case and pretty specific, and I would say egregious instance of a
Mm.
school district. Like they had ample opportunity to course correct, and
Hmm.
for whatever reason, they just didn't. But that too speaks to why free speech is important, because effectively what the school district was saying is only our idea matters.
Yeah.
Your idea, parent, doesn't matter, right? And regardless of whether or not that happens to my family or to a family with whose beliefs I don't agree, like squelching speech in that way, I think is really dangerous.
Yeah. Well, thankfully, the court came down in favor of the families, right?
That's
And
right.
that's an example of what we talk about on this podcast and elsewhere, of kind of the legal regime for free speech and then the cultural regime, which I think are two related but separate kind of phenomena.
Hmm.
And maybe turning to that second one of the culture of free speech, you said yourself, I think rightly, that to express your conscience, your values, your ideas, you either need to write it down or speak it out loud. We talk a lot about thinking aloud in public, that speaking your ideas is actually part of how you come to know what it is you really believe and refine them by clashing them with other humans through communication. So one of the values we try and kind of abstract from through these conversations is how people can better communicate their ideas. And so we like to speak with leaders like yourself who are versed in communication, of any lessons you might be able to draw from your own method of how you communicate your ideas, whether it is writing a statement or a piece for some periodical or giving a speech, going on a podcast, giving a talk, whatever it is,
Yeah.
whatever the media forum is, if there's any kind of principles you can induce on your method and share for how other people can better communicate their conscience.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. And by no means do I pretend to have a monopoly on the ideas here or that I've got it dialed in all the time. I often listen to maybe an interview that I've done or watch some talk and I go, oh, I could have said that differently, or I had too many verbal tics or something like that. But I would say first and foremost, practice. There, no one um, uh, is so good that they don't need to practice, right? And so that's just something that I think is really important. I was actually speaking to a group recently, and I told them, "Hey, start off with your story also." Particularly if someone is new to speaking in a public forum, I think that's really important. I think often we want to go in with data and we want to go in with hard facts, and you want to go in with kind of the logos, right, the logic. But go in with the pathos is sometimes really, really helpful. It also, I think, can like lower your heart rate, lower your blood pressure, right? Because when I go in and I'm talking about my experience, well, that's mine. I know that well. I can
Mm.
talk about maybe, if it's my own kids. That listen, I've got thousands of those stories, and I can just draw from those um, with greater ease than I can talk about the statistics from some research institute, whatever. And then you get nervous, and then you get tripped up over the data. So I would say lead with the pathos and not the logos. Another thing that helps me. So this is definitely not going to be for everybody, Chris, but I'm a runner, and so I use that time when I'm running to
Mm.
just go over concepts in my head. And by the way, probably 50% of those concepts just end up on the cutting room floor, and they just
Mm-hmm.
stay out there on the run, and they never make it to a presentation, and that's fine. But I go over that stuff, and whether it's coming up with new ideas or just kind of workshopping a little bit, I find that solitude is really helpful for me.
Yes. Well, I appreciate that because I definitely am not a runner, but I think we all have those activities that we pursue in solitude when there is sort of just that opportunity to let your mind wander or, put on automation, whatever it is the task it is that you're doing, and just use that time to be in your head and prepare yourself. And I really appreciate your connection here to even classical rhetoric, thinking about the pathos, the logos. Maybe you'll even want to say something about the ethos of it as the speaker too as well. But in the time we have, I also really do want to make sure that we connect this back to music, because that's the thing I've really been itching to hear from you. And I'm so excited to hear what you're going to say about that. Fans of the show will know that I love to always ask the blue sky question. You have a beautiful blue sky today. The question of, if you had all the money, the time, the resources, what would be a project that you would pursue? And I absolutely love that you've really landed on music as a tool and a medium and a forum to pursue this way of expression and listening and connection. So I'd love to hear you say some more about that too.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. And it was mentioned earlier that I'm based here in Nashville, so I'm in Music City. There's always kind of a song in the air. That's just kind of how it goes. But when I think about uh, what we really need in our culture right now, so much of it centers on civil discourse. I spend
Mm.
most of my time working in education, but sometimes you find that people don't even want to sit in the same room with one another and wrestle with these hard ideas because we've sort of forgotten how to listen. So in some ways, like the other side of the free speech coin, I think, is listening well and being able to sit, with these ideas and with one another, so that we can engage with ideas that are different from our own. Well, I find that music is super helpful in doing that. Music is part of every known civilization. There's a reason that people go to live concerts with perfect strangers and they're all singing the same song. There's a reason that music is a part of every sort of worship service and faith community, right? Music is just a real bonding element. And so I started this project. It's called the Come Together Music Project. And what we do is we use music to find common ground and bridge divides. And the way that it works just practically is that I sit down with 2 or 3 people. I send them some questions and prompts beforehand. And these are things that are kind of universal experiences. So for you two, I might say, hey, what's a song that reminds you of being 21? Because, you were both 21 at some point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then what you do is you respond with a song. We listen to about 30, 45 seconds of it, and then you tell us why you picked it. And I have done this now, dozens of times. I've done it with state Supreme Court justices, and I've done it with think tank leaders, and I've done it with teachers, and just a range of people, right? Because everyone can do this. This is really accessible, and what I find is that it helps us humanize one another. So we might start with, hey, what's a song that reminds you of being 21? But then we might move to, hey, what's a song that reminds you of your dad? And whether or not you have a great relationship with your dad or didn't know him, right? You'll be able to think of something, and then we're going to talk, and then we're going to get to know you. And what I find is humanizing one another makes it easier for us to then have the next conversation about something that's maybe a little more heavy, a little more fraught. And because we're sort of saying like, oh, that person, that's not an enemy. Turns out that's just another human with life experiences that are relatable. So now maybe we can move forward, and I can engage with what they're saying on a different topic.
Wow.
Sorry, no, I really just want to respond to that. To me, I think the most important thing I even took from that was the power of music to help us find our common humanity. And
Yeah.
I think it does help your approach to even try to find a kind of universal human experience, like what it is to be a certain age, or a relationship with a parent, or something like that. But even just to have that moment to ground the person in that aspect of our universal humanity before we try to get to something contentious. And I really did want to follow up to say, like, do you think there is something about the fact that it's the music? Like, would it be the same if you just asked someone to share a story about their father or the relationship they never had with the father, something like that? Like
Yeah.
what do you get is really important about the music itself? I'm
Yeah,
curious.
it's a great question. I mean, because each one of these sessions is part storytelling and part listening party. But I think the music is important because it does 2 things, or at least 2 things. It forces us to actually sit in silence, or without speaking for that the 45 minutes that it takes to just listen. We don't do that enough in our lives, right? Things are moving so quickly. We're so fast paced. We're checking our phones 200 times a day. If things aren't happening in like 12-second increments, we just lose attention. So to be able to sit there, so I just did this, and one of the guests picked Led Zeppelin's song "Cashmere" as a song that got him through a real low point in life. Well, "Cashmere" is like an 8-minute song. So I listened to 8 minutes of it to figure out which 45 seconds to do. So we're listening to this song, and it's just really musical, and it's driving, and it's really instrumental. And so I think there's a benefit to just that time. I also think, I mean, lots of things are happening, and I'm not a scientist, but there have been some great things written and studies done about what's happening inside our brains when we're listening to music. And so it's doing certain things. It's calming us in many cases, right? It's sort of allowing us to use a different part of our brain that is not just the focused on these urgent things that are right in front of us. So I think that there are some things that are happening mentally and psychologically that are really important that happen because of the music.
Yeah, well said. And Joya preempted, and I had kind of a similar question about maybe trying to abstract some of the principles within music. I also wonder that if some of it is, people often use the phrase the universal language.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, music or math tend to be kind of the two disciplines where that phrase is used, and I think it works and is appropriate in the sense of this notion, right, that there's something universalizing about the aural experience of musical sounds and tones as well, and that there's an emotional link.
For sure. And I think it's, two things I'll mention quickly because I know we're coming on time, but music is so sticky, right? There's a quote that I love. It says that every memory has a soundtrack all its own. And that is just so true. And if you and I talk about an experience that we had, if we talked about, what it was like to be 21 and you picked a song that reminds you of that time, when I hear that song again, there's a very good chance that I'll remember that conversation.
I
right?
see.
These two things are just so sticky, memory and music, which I think is really helpful. I also think that using someone else's art form helps us to kind of unlock some vulnerability that would be challenging to do on our own. So if you said to me, Shaka, write a song about your wife, I'd be like, that's really intimidating. I can't do that. Right. But if you said, Shaka, what's a song that reminds you of your wife? Now that I can do. And by the way, it might be a different song in 3 months, right? Because seasons change and how we're feeling from day to day changes. But that I could do. I can use someone else's art to access some things that were already intrinsic. And music does that in a way that I dare say math doesn't.
For sure.
Yeah.
To give a little plug though, don't forget music really is math, and in the
That's fair.
ancient times, music was studied as part of math. Music is mathematics in motion. It's all proportion and frequency.
I'm going to tell my kids that when they're complaining about their homework.
Mathematics in motion and in vibration, right?
I love it.
No, but that is wonderful, and this is why we love this question, because it does draw out some fascinating nuances and distinctions. And you, I think, are one of the first people not only to highlight the importance of listening as the other half of a communication equation, but then this specific form of listening through music. And I think it just highlights wonderfully the power of the different forms of communication and expression that we have available to us as human beings, all of which play a role in helping us communicate our conscience, as you said at the outset. And I think free speech is intimately intertwined with all of these forms of expression, right? So I love the idea of building a future of greater free speech around greater expressions of all forms, including artistic and musical ones. So thank you for that inspiration. And then just to close out our conversation, just wonder if you have any other words of advice or inspiration for people who are out there looking to find their voice, to communicate their conscience more confidently, how they might do that.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. And again, thanks for having me on. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and maybe I can get you two to be part of the Come Together Music Project, because I think that would be really fun. And and we would necessarily get to know one another a little better.
For sure.
So we'll have to book that. One of the things that I really had the honor to participate on is something called the State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So every state has one of these. It's a part of civil rights law and the Civil Rights Act. So I was on the Tennessee State Advisory Committee, and that committee is tasked with investigating potential civil rights violations within their respective states. And one of the things that we did while I was chair of that committee is we looked at whether or not some laws that had been passed at the state level here in Tennessee were having a chilling effect on free speech. And those meetings happen in every state at regular occurrences, usually monthly or every other month. They're open to the public. People can give public comment, and you can and members of the public can come if they're concerned, and if there are audience members of yours that are concerned, hey, this is happening in my city, town, state, whatever. This is a forum specifically tasked with investigating potential violations of those rights. And you can come and you can share for 5 minutes and say, hey, this is what's happening in my community. I don't think it's right. Would love for somebody else to look into it. And I think it's a pretty low risk deal. Many are happening, most I would say happen virtually now. So it's really easy to tap into. But yeah, the state advisory committees to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, I think is a great place for people to get plugged in, and it's just an underutilized resource.
Wonderful. Thank you for that as well. And that is the end of our time for today's discussion. We really appreciate your time to join us, Shaka. And for all of you out there listening, as always, you can hear us Free Speech Forward every 2 weeks. And we will look forward to seeing you next time on all major podcasts where ILV's Dissidents channel plays.